Welcome to this video. My name is Ewald Demeyere and today I would like to explore Fenaroli's fifth Partimento using moti del basso. According to Partimento theory, the opening of this Partimento in B-flat major basically consists of a suspension on the first scale step in the bass. Since its resolution, that is, the leading note, is followed by a stepwise ascent to the tonic, the syncopated first scale step should be realized with a 4-2 chord with a pure fourth. As for Gjerdingen, however, he would probably see this beginning as a schema he calls do-re-mi, implying that a given bass should be accompanied with B-flat, C and D in the soprano on the downbeats of the first 3 bars. He would probably also call the first bar of the bass boring, because not much is happening there, in contrast to the interesting second bar. The contrast between those bars is an obvious trigger for the Partimento player to play an interesting right hand above the boring bass of bar 1 and a boring right hand on the interesting bass of bar 2. This is just one of many possible realizations respecting the suspension of the first scale step, the do-re-mi, and the opposition between boring and interesting. From bar 3 to 6, the bass ascends stepwise from the first to the fourth scale step, a progression which normally would be realized according to the rule of the octave. In this case, however, each individual scale step lasts for a complete bar, what would result in 2 static realization. Fenaroli explains that this type of bass should be realized as a moto del basso that rises stepwise and gives a number of ways to do this. Amongst others, one could play a triad on each downbeat and a 6th chord on the middle of each bar. Note that Fenaroli wants the 6th of each 6th chord to be tied to the 5th of the following triad, probably to avoid the perception of parallel fifths. Another way of realizing this moto del basso is by playing a 7th on each downbeat, apart from the first one, which resolves downward to the 6th on the middle of each bar. Important remark: since each 7th must be prepared, the 6th in the preceding bar must be followed by an ascending leap of a 3rd to the octave on the 4th quarter note of each bar. Let's skip ahead now to the transition from bar 15 to 16. At this spot, the key is F major and the syncopated C acts as a suspension on the 5th scale step which resolves to the B flat in the second half of bar 16. This passage can be realized in a number of ways. First, one could play in counter motion a 4-2 chord on the syncopated C as well as on the B flat. You will hear it first in the rudimentary version with only plain chords, then in a version with broken chords. As I have explained in my discussion on Fenaroli's first Partimento, however, this is not a first choice solution, since a 4-2 chord is followed normally by a 6th chord, not by another 4-2 chord. While this standard realization would not be entirely convincing in the first Partimento, it does work in this one. Still, this 6th chord has to be followed then by another 4-2 chord, to be played on the second half of the B flat. From bar 18 to 22, a new moto del basso occurs, namely a pattern that ascends a 4th and descends a 5th, today also commonly known as a circle of fifths. The most accomplished realization of this moto is undoubtedly with a chain of 7ths alternating between the upper voices, including an imitation in the right hand of the 8-note bass motif. Let's skip ahead now to bars 26 and 27, which function as a bridge between F major and G minor. While the key of G minor becomes clear from the F sharp on the downbeat of bar 28, its sixth scale step, the E flat, could already be introduced before it, smoothing the modulation. This is actually a technique that 18th century composers used quite often and which I call the oblique modulation. An obvious way to realize bars 26 and 27 is by playing parallel thirds in one voice, while the other upper voice remains on a stationary F for a bar and a half before descending to the E flat in the middle of bar 27. The stationary note could also be replaced, for instance, by 3 half notes F, C, F. You will hear both versions one after another. Again, in bars 28 to 30, the Partimento player is confronted with bass notes changing too slowly to simply realize them according to the rule of the octave. In this case, however, there is no moto del basso that can be played instead. What can be done then to improve the musical quality? An important technique for this situation is the adding of a dissonance to the regular chords of the rule of the octave. On the downbeat of bar 28, for instance, one could hold the E flat from the second half of the previous bar, which creates an expressive diminished seventh above the F sharp. And on the downbeat of bar 30, a D nicely postpones the C sharp above the E flat. Here is one possible realization of this passage, adding the 8-note motif of bar 18 to it. Note that in bar 31 to 33, 2 consecutive suspensions occur. The first one of the 5th scale step, the second one of the 4th scale step. Both suspensions actually represent a fragment of the moto del basso that descends in ties. Still being in G minor, one should play a 4-2 chord with a minor second, with E flat, on the syncopated D, making this type of 4-2 chord arguably the most intense of all 4-2 chords. On the syncopated C, one should play a 4-2 chord with an augmented fourth. An ornamented version of these bars could sound as follows. In bars 35 to 37, Fenaroli presents a pattern that is the complement of the one starting in bar 3, that is, a moto del basso that descends stepwise. Again, several realizations are possible. When one decides on a pattern with 7s and 6ths, the issue of preparing the 7ths doesn't present itself here, for each resolution simply prepares the next 7th, a consequence of the fact that the bass descends stepwise instead of ascends stepwise. A small remark about the pattern starting in bar 43. It looks as if Fenaroli simply reproduces the moto del basso of bar 3 and following, but there is a twist. Instead of modulating at the end of this pattern to F major again, the do re mi in bars 46 and 47 is not presented in that key but in E flat major. This implies that when one decides on playing the pattern with 5ths and 6ths in bar 43 to 45, an A flat works better than an A natural in the middle of bar 44. Let's have a look now at bars 51 and 52. While a version with a stationary note in one voice and parallel thirds in the other is obviously beyond reproach, this passage can also be set polyphonically. One could start tasto solo, then imitate the bass at the octave in the middle voice half a bar later, subsequently imitate the middle voice one tone higher in the upper voice, and finally imitate the upper voice a fourth lower in the middle voice. An imitation starting with a 9/8 suspension. From the middle of bar 56 on, Fenaroli reuses the pattern that ascends stepwise, but makes it progress twice as fast, in half notes instead of in whole notes. And instead of concluding this pattern with a modulation to F major, he transforms the pattern that ascends stepwise into a pattern that ascends chromatically, which Gjerdingen would call a monte. Again, several ways of realizing this passage are possible. You will hear one in which the sixth of each raised bass note is anticipated above the preceding natural bass note, adding syncopated notes to the right hand that enhance this setting. Hopefully you've liked this video. For more ideas on how to realize partimenti, check out my other videos. Bye!